Okay, dear friends. Today I'm talking about Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, Mishnah 11. It's the second part of the Zug, the second part of the pair. It was Shemaiah and Avtalyon. Last week I talked about Avtalyon, and this week about Shemaiah. And if you remember in this pair of Shemaiah of Avtalyon, who received, it says Shemaiah of Avtalyon received from them meaning Yudah ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shatach, and it was Shemaiah who said to love work, to keep away from authority, meaning positions of authority, and also from the authorities. Now, two things have to be said about this zug, about this pair. Number one, I mentioned last time, both of them were descended from converts. The question whether they were converts themselves or descended, the opinion seems to be that they were descended from converts. An interesting thing, though, is that the Talmud says they were descended from Sancheriv. Now, that's a very unusual lineage, because Sancheriv was the king of Assyria at the time, with his capital in Nineveh, who basically exiled the 10 northern tribes of Israel 722 years before the Common Era. And here we have two rabbinic figures of the Pharisees who are in now Judea in the southern kingdom, and they're descended from Sancheriv, which is very unusual. In other words, it's the southern kingdom which Sancheriv was not able to capture, as told in the book of Kings 2, where God sent an angel during the time of Hezekiah, and it created this sort of raj, this loud noise, and the Assyrians thought that the kingdom of Judea had asked the Egyptians and others to help them, and they ran away, as told in Kings 2. And both these people are descendants from the Assyrian king, according to this tradition. Very unusual lineage. And it seems that you wonder what also the meaning of it might be. Now, as I mentioned also, that Shemaiah said to keep away from authority. We have to understand what we're talking about. We're now in an episode where the Hasmonean Empire is finished, and it's now under the Roman conquest. So the Hasmonean Empire, whether they were good or bad, and Alexander Janus was not exactly the best Hasmonean king. He favored the Sadducees to the Pharisees. It was Shimon ben Shatach who, through partially the power of his sister Shlomtzion, and I guess through his own abilities, was able to bring back the Pharisee majority to the Sanhedrin. So it was difficult times under Hasmoneans, but at least it was controversies within ourselves, let's say. But what's happening now is you have a Roman conquest, where basically the sovereign entity is a non-Jewish sovereignty, and this is a whole different picture, because you never know where it's going to go. So Yudah ben Tabai already says, first of all, keep away from positions of authority. It's not a healthy thing. I was just reading in the Jerusalem Talmud, where the Jerusalem Talmud says about, we also have in the Haggadah of Pesach, well, Elazar ben Azariah says, I feel like I'm almost 70 years and I was not able to get the rabbis to agree with me that we should also recite the Exodus story from Egypt at night until Ben Zoma made a drasha and learned it from the verses. So the Jerusalem Talmud says, why does he say that I'm almost 70 years old? And Jerusalem Talmud has a different take on this than the Babylonian Talmud. It says, because people have positions of power, like the head of the Sanhedrin, which Elazar ben Azariah received, it usually brings to such a situation that they don't have longevity. They don't live a long time. Too many people are trying to get to them. So it's unusual, but since he was very anav, he was very humble and very human, and he had humility. Because of that, he lived a long time. But in general, the rabbis say, keep away from the limelight and keep away from power. And definitely, in this case, keep away from the authorities, because the authorities are non-Jewish authorities, the Romans, and they have their own considerations. So it's not always worth it to be so close to them. And so Avtalyon then also realizes that we are living, remember, each one says something positive and negative. Avtalyon, who is the Av Beit Din, says something in the negative here. And Avtalyon also realizes that the Romans are in charge. And therefore he says something, and he says it in code, which is a very unusual thing. Avtalyon says, Chachamim, rabbis, hizaru b'divrechem, be very cautious, very careful with what you say. Shema tachovu chovat galut, because you might bring upon somebody to be exiled. And then you or that person will have to go to a place of the bitter waters, hamayim haraim, the bad waters or the bitter waters. V'yishtu hatalmidim habayim acharechem, and then the students who come in the next generation will have to drink from those bitter waters, and they shall die, and the name of heaven will be desecrated. Very unusual code, which he is saying. Number one, why is he talking in code? And number two, what is the meaning of this metaphor? O rabbis, be careful with your words, lest you bring somebody to be exiled, and you shall be exiled to the place of the bitter waters, and the students who come after you will drink from them and die, and the name of heaven, meaning the name of God, will be desecrated. So, there are two ways to understand this. Number one is based on what happened to the teachers of Avtalyon, Shimon ben Shattach, and specifically Yehuda ben Tabai. If you remember, they had to go to Egypt. They were banished by Alexander Janus. So now they're under a Roman Empire. The chances of being banished by saying the wrong thing is much, much higher. If you say something not politically correct, even if you didn't mean it, you don't know what's going to happen. Oznaim lakotel, even the walls have ears and you never know who's listening. You have to be very careful. But a second way to understand this, and I don't think it doesn't necessarily disagree with what I just said. But another way to understand this is in general. Once you move out of the Beit Midrash, once you move out of the place where you had what we call Anshe Shlomeinu in Hebrew. Once you're not around your friends and you don't know who's listening, and if you are talking in public forums, even if you think you're not talking in public forums, you'll discover that you are talking in public forums. Therefore, you have to be very careful what you say. And what you say could be heard by different people. You know, sometimes in the past, there were always, on the news, you would hear about certain rabbi who would say something to a group of his students, and then it would create some scandal. And they would say, well, this was a rabbi talking to his students. He didn't actually mean to imply. It was taken out of context. Avtalyon says that's not an excuse. You have to assume anybody is listening. So, first of all, he's addressing this because we're under the Roman Empire at this point. It's a new ball game. But secondly, in general, this is something which you have to understand. That the more you become a public figure, whether you are in your eyes or not, the more careful you have to be. You have to watch out what you say. It's not just a question of court of law, like we had at the beginning, when we said Chachamim yizaru b'divrechem, when we're talking about a court of law. This is not about a court of law. This is about interpreting the Torah in general. And you cannot just do it for your Anshe Shlomeinu, for your group. It has to be somebody who is understood by the outside. And if it's not understood by the outside, or if it's understood differently than the outside, why say it? As Menachem Mendel of Kotsk once said, who we're talking about tomorrow, not everything you think you have to say, and not everything you say you have to write. So a person has to be very careful with what they are saying. And think about it yourself. What are the implications of what you're saying? And assume it's going to be twisted. Okay, if somebody twists something completely out of its context, there's very little you can do. But it doesn't mean you have to help them. Now, the Torah is different. Moshe Rabbeinu, it says that Moshe Rabbeinu came up to Mount Sinai, the Midrash says in Midrash Rabbah, and he's waiting for God as God is writing the Torah. And he sees that God writes in the Torah in chapter 1, Naaseh Adam b'tzalmeinu, let us make man in our image. And the Midrash says, Moses says to God, what are you doing? You're writing, let us make man in God's image? People are not going to understand this. They're going to make mistakes. God says to Moses, this is what I have to write. Those who want to make mistakes, they can make mistakes. So that's the Torah. But it's different if you're an interpreter of the Torah. If you're a rabbinic scholar, you don't have that possibility. You have to think of what other people are going to say. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu in the Midrash is asking God and saying, God, is this a good idea? Because that's the job of the rabbi, to think, how are other people going to do this? And how much explaining am I going to have to do after in order to explain to people what it's about? Because rabbis are defenders of the law. So you don't want to be the one who creates the problem in the first place. And if you cannot be a defender of the law because you don't know how, then let somebody else do the talking. That's okay. But this is a very, very important point. Now, another thing I want to say about this too. Avtalyon is writing in a way which is, I said, metaphoric. Let's try to understand the metaphor. I'll try to explain it according to Rashi. Be very careful what you say, because you might go into exile. And you might go to places where there are people who have very different opinions than you. People who don't believe in the Torah. And they might even have an axe to grind against the Torah. Or you might explain it to somebody who is a student who didn't really understand you. So be very careful not to take students like that. And they'll go explain it to somebody else and say, my rabbi was, I've seen these things before. Somebody says, I'm a disciple, I was a student of this famous rabbi. Yeah, they met them once in their lifetime, they become the disciple. Or they knew them for 2 weeks. Yeah, I've seen this many times. And then they have all these crazy ideas. People say they study with Rabbi Soloveitchik, they study with Rabbi Cook, and they say a lot of strange things, which obviously makes you understand that they didn't really. But once you say these things and others actually believe you, this creates a desecration of the name of heaven. And this is called drinking the bad waters, because Torah, of course, is the metaphor of water. Ein mayim ela Torah. In rabbinic literature, the Torah is called water. Hoi kol atzamei l'chul hamayim. Anybody who is thirsty, let them go to water. Lo rav lalechem v'lo tzama l'mayim ki'im l'ruchi, amar Hashem. The time will come when there will not be thirst for water, and there will not be hunger for bread, but for the Spirit of God. So the Torah is called water in this sense. And the bitter waters are explanations which are inaccurate. And once they start inaccurate, they continue inaccurate. The Talmud tells a story, and the Talmud actually says, what does it mean to be a rabbi, to be yoreh, which is the degree that a rabbi gets, which is called a teacher. Talmud says it's somebody who would explain the Torah accurately. And then the Talmud gives an example in Sanhedrin of somebody who made a mistake in teaching the Torah. Of a certain scholar who came to a town, and he comes to this town, and he sees in that town on Pesach, they are making their matzah with water from, they're making bread with water from a swamp and calling it matzah. And he says to them, this is not matzah, this is bread. It sat there for more than 18 minutes. So they said, well, there was a scholar who came here a year ago, and he said that if we take the flour and mix it with water from the swamp, then it's like matzah. I said, that's not possible. And he tried to find out who the scholar was who came there the year before, and he found out that the scholar, whose, I guess, Hebrew was not that great, he said to them, if they mix it with mei beitzim, which means egg, then it's not chametz, it's not unleavened, if they take flour with egg. But they heard him say mei bitzaim, which means swamp water instead of egg. So he was not clear, and here they're making now chametz on Pesach, thinking that it's allowed because it's mei bitzaim, and he said mei beitzim. They thought he meant swamp water, and he meant egg yolks or egg whites. So basically, yoreh means, the degree a rabbi gets is somebody who is able to explain things with clarity. That's the whole idea. Now, this other thing of coding, what's the code? It might be a fear of the Roman Empire. And we've seen this before. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who's going to be the first person who's going to talk in chapter 2, who is the redactor, the editor of the Mishnah, who's nicknamed Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, or Ribbi, was very aware of the fact that when he was putting out the Mishnah as a document for the first time, because before that it was Be'al Peh, it was oral, it was not written, that others would be able to see. And writing under the Roman Empire, he did a little bit of a censorship. For instance, if you read the Mishnah under Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, you will be very surprised to see that in the 6 orders of the Mishnah, the festival of Chanukah is missing. It's just not there. And it happened hundreds of years before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Now, it's true, the Talmud makes up for it. The Talmud in Shabbat, in chapter 2, brings 3.5 folio pages discussing Hanukkah and how to light the candles. Not a lot, but it is something. But the Mishnah leaves it out. It doesn't leave out Purim. That's also rabbinic. Why is it the Mishnah leaves out Hanukkah? Well, some people say because the Pharisees, the rabbis, were against the fact that the Hasmoneans as Kohanim became kings. That is true. But to leave out all of Hanukkah because of that? Why would you want to do that? It's true that in one place in the Mishnah, the word Hanukkah is mentioned as a time during the year, but not as a festival. But I think that Yehuda Nasi, writing under the Roman Empire, after the destruction of the temple, and after the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt, is censoring himself. Because Hanukkah was a revolt against a non-Jewish empire called the Seleucids. And under the Bar Kokhba revolt, the motto was, remember the Hasmoneans. And just as they were able to succeed against the Seleucids, the Yavanim, the Greeks, we can succeed against the Romans. So the Romans really didn't like the Hasmoneans. And we're not crazy about Hanukkah. So he left it out. The people all knew about it. Sometimes you have to be careful. You don't want to say that the Jews are trying to create another uprising. It's not helpful. So the point is, under the Romans, the leadership realized that sometimes you have to be quiet. And he's doing this on purpose, in my opinion. Avtalyon, writing in code to realize that certain things will have to be censored, or at least coded, or at least kept among ourselves so that should not be understood the wrong way. And Avtalyon, if I might add, could easily say to them, look, I understand these things, because I come from the outside. My family, we're from Sancheriv. And remember what happened with Sancheriv. He took those 10 tribes of Israel, and they assimilated and disappeared, and we don't want that to happen. You know, there was a story here in Israel, a certain couple who converted to Judaism. I heard this story actually from my father. It was much before I was involved in conversion. And after that, they started having children. And they said, you know, because of the Shoah, there needs to be more Jews in the world. So we have to bring many children into the world so that there are more Jews. Sometimes somebody coming from the outside can see that, ways to react. So Shmai and Avtalyon, with their very unusual origins from Sancheriv, realize that now under the Romans, we have to be careful. We have to do things and take steps to preserve the future of the Jewish people. We have to be careful what we say and who's listening. And we have to take the steps to make sure that there is another generation. I want to end off by something which I will expand on next time. We are on the 4th of the 5 zugot, the 5 pairs. The way it works is there are 5 pairs plus 2 individuals. I called them at the beginning 7, but it's really 5. They're 5 and 2, which is very interesting. Who are the 2? Rabbi Gamliel and Shimon ben Gamliel, his son. It's also, by the way, where we are now in Avtalyon, it's the movement from what was the Kohanim before Avtalyon, who were the heads of the Sanhedrin, and then eventually after Avtalyon, Hillel will be the first head of the Sanhedrin, president of the Sanhedrin, who is descended from King David. So it'll be a movement from the priests to those who are descended from King David. Why? Because there's no more Jewish sovereignty. So because of that, we want to remember the Jewish royal blood from King David, even if we have to put them at the head of the Sanhedrin. And that will continue from the Gamliel family, Shimon ben Gamliel, Hillel, and they are the ones who are the heads of the Sanhedrin, descended from King David. But there's a structure, and I'll talk more about this structure next week when we talk about Hillel and Shammai. If you remember, at the beginning of this chapter, the structure of the chapter really goes 5-2-5-2. It says that in the transmission of the Torah, Moses received the Torah from Sinai and gave it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the great assembly. That was the 5. And after that you have the one who's left over from the men of the great assembly, who's Simon the Just, and then Antigonos ish Socho, his student. So it's 5 and 2. Here also there are 5 pairs up to Hillel and Shammai, and the 2 are Rabbi Gamliel and Shimon ben Gamliel. So it goes 5 and 2, and then 5 and 2. So the question is, what is 5 and 2 and 5 and 2? And I'm going to surprise you when I explain this, and I'm going to explain it that it's not 5 and 2 and 5 and 2, it's actually 2, 5, 2, 5, 2, etc. And I'm going to leave this as a mystery this time, and next time we'll talk about the meaning of the 5 and the 2, and what is the 2, and what is the 5, and what is the meaning of the structure, the numerical structure of chapter 1 in Pirkei Avot, when we talk about next week of Hillel and Shammai, the 5th of the pairs, and the ones who are also not going to just remain as a pair, but they're going to create the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. Shalom, shalom, everyone.